here.
All right.
Excuse me.
So we have
Send me an email.
tonight Derek Lidow. He's a global CEO, entrepreneur, and professor here at the Keller Center, and a startup coach. And he has recently published a book that has come out. I'm sure a lot of folks got it. He's also going to give away 2 books. So involved in the conversation tonight, and let's have a great conversation with him. So this is called Startup Leadership: How Savvy Entrepreneurs Turn Their Ideas into Successful Enterprise. I welcome Derek.
I'm going to stay close to the microphone tonight. Usually I walk around, but my older son got married on Saturday, and it was a hell of a party. And I had to yell over the band for 5 hours straight. So my voice is not up to snuff, and so I'm going to stick close to the microphone. The microphone is going to be my good friend tonight. And to simplify the argument, I took the liberty of laying it out on the blackboard. So I wouldn't have to waste time writing it down as we go through the lecture, but I'm sure it all makes sense already because it's pretty straightforward. So ultimately, I do really appreciate you also coming out on a double holiday week. So I know that everybody has major schedules and families and the like. I also want to thank Inu for inviting me, and Jean Gray is one of my major supporters and reviewed several versions of the book, helped me make it better. So I appreciate the support that I've had from the community. I became passionate about finding out what was going on with innovation when, as a newly minted PhD, I went out into the real world, and I expected everybody to listen to what I had to say and change what they were doing immediately, based upon my ideas and the like. And that didn't work at all. And it was an enormous disappointment to me, what was going on here. And I've, ever since then, become a major student of what it takes to actually have an impact on the world. To take your ideas and have them translated into something that either becomes an enterprise or becomes a new division within an existing company and the like. So I've spent the better part of 35 years really avidly taking notes and investigating, and now for the last 3 years being an academic researcher on this subject. Tonight I want to talk about 3 things. The first one is that value in the world is not created by ideas. Innovation is not ideas. It's really done purely by leaders. Without leaders, no value creation. The second one is that these leaders are a specific type. I call them entrepreneurial leaders. And they have 5 specific skills that they become masters at. You master these 5 skills, you can take an idea, turn it into something valuable. The third point is that these skills do not take any special talent or traits, and therefore they're something that you can develop within yourself if you are motivated to do so. So those are the 3 points. Now, the sort of corollary to that is that success is really in your own hands, but you have to be motivated to do that. You have to develop some specific skills. And then your ideas are things that you can take charge of in changing the world. But first, let me make this very important point. It's not ideas that create value, it's leaders. And let me illustrate that with two examples on the opposite ends of the idea continuum. So let me talk about, I think, what virtually everybody will consider, one of the great ideas, if not the greatest idea in the 20th century, the transistor. The transistor started the electronics revolution that's still going on and impacting us today. Countless trillions and trillions of dollars are related to what the transistor has enabled. Without the transistor, the world certainly would be nowhere near what it is today. So let's talk about the transistor. It's as good an idea as it gets. And it was developed by a team at Bell Labs, 3 physicists. One of the physicists, understands that this can change the world, and so he goes and he leaves Bell Labs, recruits the best engineers that he can find, moves out to California, and he sets back the cause of the electronics revolution by years. By years. Didn't have anything to do with the transistor. William Shockley was a terrible leader, and the disasters that he created around trying to commercialize the transistor set back the whole world in adopting what was an incredibly valuable idea. Now I want to contrast that with about as mundane an idea as you could possibly have. Tacos. Okay? Tacos. So, there was this chef, but he didn't have money to really open up a decent restaurant. So he opens up a taco stand. That's all he could afford to do was a taco stand. But he was very observant, cared about his customers, and he comes to the conclusion, you know what, tacos is not the best way to deliver a valuable meal experience to the customer. I'm going to switch to burritos. So even though it's a taco stand, he offers burritos. He figures out how to get the ingredients fresh every day. People really enjoy his burritos. His clientele increases. He figures out how to involve the clientele in the making of the burrito. And all of a sudden, he starts having a major impact on how people view food. This taco stand turned out to create a whole new category of food called fast casual, that today is the fastest growing part of the entire food industry. That taco stand is worth $13 billion. The chef, Steve Ells, the founder of Chipotle's, is somebody who took the most mundane of possible ideas and had a huge impact on the world, not just in the United States, but all around the world, and in how we expect food to be delivered to us and how we expect to have things fresh and alive. Mundane idea. So, it's not about the idea, because ideas don't get people to change the world. It's people that do. So ultimately, it's that transition from the idea to something, a real entity, usually a company or a division or something, okay, that does something that makes people want to change the world, change what they're doing in the world. So we need to investigate that, and that means we need to understand the people that are involved, the people that lead that process. So the people that lead that process I call entrepreneurial leaders. And I want to give a couple of examples of some entrepreneurial leaders that are well known but misunderstood. So let's start with Steve Jobs. You know, there are good biographies on Steve Jobs, so we can have, share a lot of insights about him. But again, it wasn't his idea. Okay, it was Wozniak's ideas. Okay, that changed the PC revolution. But it wasn't until Steve Jobs realized that these were potentially valuable. And Steve Jobs went and sought advice on how to commercialize these designs of Wozniak. And he accepted the advice of these people in the technology world. And then he went and he recruited extremely experienced people to come help him and Steve Wozniak commercialize their computer. And then he turned over the leadership of the company to these more experienced people. So it wasn't his idea. Okay, he didn't even lead Apple Computer in the for the first instances that he's there. But boy, is he having an impact, and he is de facto, leading the vision of what can happen there. But it's because he recruited these other people, because he listened to the advice of more experienced people, that he did that. Another example that's very pertinent here in New Jersey is Thomas Edison, because it's widely, accepted by myth, that Thomas Edison single-handedly, invented the light bulb and electrified the world. That's not true. There were light bulbs before Thomas Edison. There were incandescent carbon filament evacuated clear glass tube light bulbs before Thomas Edison. They were working. They were, lighting up museums and people's houses and the like. What Thomas Edison had was an incredibly capable group of engineers, of a diverse set of engineers nearby here, up the road, that were great at prototyping things. They could prototype things faster and more effectively than any other group on the planet. And so they could run through 1,000 prototypes and try 1,000 things in a matter of, months. 99.9% of them would fail. But Edison and his team understood that was the good part. So he was great at leading people to fail, to find the one success. And it is those types of characteristics that we want to be able to understand. What formulation do they need to come to create an entrepreneurial leader, to have insight, and to help people really be able to take ideas, however good or mundane they may be, and change the world with them. I want to point out an overarching characteristic of these entrepreneurial leaders that they all share before we sort of get into the specifics. And that is that they all are extremely good at balancing their selfishness with their selflessness. It turns out that in order to be a successful entrepreneur, you have to be enormously selfish. It's good to be selfish. You want to change the world. You want the world to do it your way. Admit it. Okay. And ultimately, that selfishness creates a certain aura. It's what attracts people to be interested in hearing your idea or potentially wanting to work with you. But unless it's balanced with a selflessness, with a desire of the leader to share the success of the venture with those that follow him first, before he benefits, then ultimately the people will not stay. They will not sacrifice. They will not do all the things that are required to make those major changes in the world actually stick and become self-sustaining. So there's this fine balance. This balance is even trickier because it changes as any enterprise matures from that idea stage to the stage when they get their first customer, and then when they figure out their first crude processes, and then they become more sophisticated and finally become self-sustaining. This balance between selfishness and selflessness has to change dramatically as these stages go from one to the other. So it's not something that is, let's say, obvious. It is not something that's intuitive. And in fact, it is the reason why only 1 in 50 entrepreneurs succeeds in taking an idea and leading it all the way to the point where it's totally self-sustaining. 1 in 50. And those 1 in 50 succeed in doing that usually because they learned from highly traumatic experiences that fortunately for them weren't fatal, economically fatal, or they might have benefited from some very wise mentorship. And those have been the historical ways to get this wisdom on how to balance the selflessness. But now we come to understand what's going on at a deeper level. And we find that entrepreneurial leadership really breaks down into 5 very specific skills that can be mastered. And fortunately, the skills don't really require any major traits or talents that you have to be born with. So the 5 skills are: 1, some basic self-awareness. Without basic self-awareness, can't get there. Second one is relationship building skills. So the ability to create relationships and to make existing relationships stronger. It's a skill. You got that skill, you become much more effective in working with people. The third one is motivating others. So getting other people passionate about helping you achieve, the vision that you've set forward, and how to do that. That's a skill. It's well understood. Specific things you can do. The fourth one is leading change. People hate to change. People don't want to change. Particularly if they feel that they're somewhat successful at doing what it is that they're doing. And that's a hard thing, potentially, is to get people to change successfully. But it is possible. It's a skill. There's certain things that you have to know how to do, and you can get people to very reliably change what they're doing and to make it something that creates value in your company. And then the fifth thing is some basic understanding of how value is created in an enterprise. For example, you need to know these 4 stages, because as these stages go by, as you transition from one stage to the next, what the enterprise expects from you and needs from you as a leader changes virtually overnight. What you were doing 1 week ago so successfully may not work anymore next week. And it confounds an enormous number of entrepreneurs, gee, why is the world conspiring against me? I know this is successful. I was doing it that way last week. Look at all the great results. It's just bad luck right now. But they don't realize that everything has changed because certain conditions have changed that require the enterprise, to operate differently, and for the leadership to operate differently. So the 5 skills are self-awareness, relationship building, motivating others, leading change, and basics of how enterprises work. So those skills are things that you need to practice. You need to know what they are. But with practice, you get better. And once you get decent enough at it, you can start attracting people to help you achieve your vision. Now, this does not require that you be born with any special traits. Some of the great entrepreneurial leaders, have traits that, again, the conventional wisdom would say will never succeed. One of my favorites is Wendy Cobb. She's one of the great entrepreneurial leaders of the last 30 years, founder of Teach for America. Of course, she graduated Princeton. That shouldn't be held against her. And, she was a woman, an idealist, an introvert that was very uncomfortable with people, didn't know the first thing about business, and ultimately with that combination, the wisdom would be, don't even try. And yet, through, unfortunately, a lot of trial and tribulation, she learned these skills and started applying them usually just in time before Teach for America was about to fail for one reason or the next. And she put them together, and today has created the most important educational reform enterprise on the planet. $300 million a year in contributions, 15,000 teachers, per year, so that's 30,000 because they work for 2 years. 30,000 teachers deployed. That's just in the United States. Now she's doing it globally. Prime example of traits really have nothing to do with it. It's just being super aware of what you need to do to get people passionately following what it is that needs to be done and willing to change. Now, that really is sort of the summary of what I want to talk about tonight. I really want to open it up for discussions at this point, because it is a little bit counter to the prevailing, let's say, conversation in entrepreneurship. The prevailing conversation in entrepreneurship is about how you leverage your idea to be bigger. How do you think bigger about your idea? How do you do it with outsourced resources so that you don't need to have any money invested? How do you attract outside capital to help you? How do you get outside capital? Well, it turns out that if you really study entrepreneurs and which entrepreneurs have contributed to the economy, how much, you find that the vast majority of entrepreneurs succeeded on a grand scale with less than $25,000 total investment in the company. That these entrepreneurs with $25,000 or less investment company account for 80% of all of the entrepreneurial value add, which is a huge fraction of all the value add in the economy. So the vast majority of all the entrepreneurial value add comes from people that did it completely on their own, did not need outside help, and ultimately, took what people would call mundane ideas and changed the world with those. They were ideas that made some people's lives better, and those people were willing to pay for that benefit. And that's all that it took to sort of start the ball rolling. So really what I want to sort of sum up is, it's not the idea, it's the leader. It's a specific type of leader, 5 skills. These skills can be learned. Once they're learned, you have massively more impact and ability to get people to work with you and to help you with your ideas. And obviously, if you want to know more about it, come visit my website, Lidow.com, buy the book. But I'd really be very happy to talk a lot about it over the next 25 minutes or so. Yes?
I feel like I need more examples.
Okay.
Like you said, you have to be aware of the process because something that worked a week ago isn't working now. Like what?
Okay. Excellent question. Excellent question. Can you pass the book back?
There's your answer.
You won't have to read it to find the answer.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's a great opening. Let me quickly go and talk about how value is created in an enterprise and why things can change very dramatically, literally overnight. There are only 2 ways that value can be created in the universe. Okay, and that is with projects or with processes. So either a project or a process takes some sort of semblance of materials or ideas or information, and they transform it into an output. Okay. A project does it on a one-off basis, usually for the first time, but certainly always different each time you do a project. While a process is about doing things repetitively. Turn the crank. Here's the input, turn the crank, here's the output. Okay. Projects are much more flexible. They create things that have never been done before. Processes are very inflexible, but very efficient. Companies need to start as pure projects. Nothing exists, and you're doing things for the first time. Particularly trying to figure out who's going to be your customer. Who wants what you think you have to sell? You have to go to those customers, you got to get their feedback, you got to change your idea, make another prototype, go back to them. It's projects, rapid projects. You need to be a leader, a good leader of projects. You manage that first stage by calling a huddle anytime that there's new information. Hey, gather around, okay, here's what they told us. Hey, why don't you go do this? We need to modify that. So you call the play, and then everybody scatters, and things come together, and you go talk to the customer, and then you huddle again. So it's pure project. Many people screw it up because they try and impose processes at this point in time. And processes only go and make your end product mediocre at that point. now, let's say you get a customer. The whole life changes. Okay. Now all of a sudden you have a customer, you've got to pay attention to that customer. And you've got to figure out how to serve them the way they want, reliably. Okay. And so what you have to start doing is creating some processes. To deliver your product, you need some processes to keep the customer happy, or to at least measure whether or not they're happy. And you need some processes to go find some new customers. You need at least 3 crude processes. And it turns out that's very tricky because you've got to create projects to create processes. And so there's this project-process transition. Screws up a lot of entrepreneurs, this project-process transition. Many, many entrepreneurs fall so much in love with the project phase that they never want to leave it, and so that they keep things as projects, and that creates problems with the quality of the product, with the reproducibility of the results, with the cost structure, with all sorts of stuff. So, you need different leadership in stage 2. In stage 3, what you need to do is actually create a set of processes that can be flexible enough to respond to competition, to changes in the economic environment, to new versions of the product that you want to produce, and the like. And so these are sophisticated processes that are required, often requiring significant investments in software or equipment or sophisticated people or consultants or the like. So sometimes a whole, different cast of characters. Again, leadership challenges are very different in that 3rd stage. The 4th stage is, which often entrepreneurs are so exhausted by the 3rd stage that they never want to attempt the 4th stage, but they need to, is that you ultimately have to figure out how to make your enterprise self-sustaining. Through no fault of your own, your customers are going to go away, some of them. They'll get old, tastes will change, whatever. And so you always have to have the ability in your organization, if you want it to be truly valuable, to be able to rejuvenate a new set of customers at a faster rate than the other set of customers age out. This requires a new set of projects and processes specifically tailored to innovation. And it creates often a friction, a huge friction within the company, because you've just gone through this phase where you cared about having the most productive and efficient processes around, and now you want to impose these things that are risky, these new ideas, and these new types of products, or going after customers that you're not sure about the economics. And so you're trying to reimpose all this uncertainty. And often entrepreneurs fail at being able to resolve that culture clash because they don't realize what's happening. They don't realize it's going to come. It was a little bit of a long-winded answer, but I didn't want to go into it unless somebody asked a question. Thank you. Yeah, up there.
You talk about leadership, but I still think that idea also is very important. Without idea, you can lead something, but what's that for?
So it doesn't need much of an idea. Steve Ells with Chipotle's started with tacos. He ended up with burritos. Sam Walton, did drugstores in small towns where nobody else cared about doing drugstores in small towns. People thought it was the worst idea ever, and he turned it into, Walmart. Yes, there's certain minimum requirements to see if an idea can become a real live self-sustaining enterprise. But those are very small requirements. There has to be some value add. You have to improve the life of somebody to the point where they're willing to pay you, and that they're paying you more than it would cost to deliver that benefit. That's it. Once you get past that stage, all ideas are absolutely entrepreneurially worthy. So there's a overfixation today on, the idea. And certainly, I'm not saying all ideas are equally valuable, but all ideas are, once they get past that stage, are equally potential for making a successful enterprise and a successful entrepreneur as defined by somebody who, creates a self-sustaining, value-producing enterprise. So, no, I don't really get so excited about ideas. Yes, sir.
So the qualities that you described for an entrepreneurial leader seem qualities that would be valuable in any leader. So can you distinguish between what makes them particularly significant?
Yeah. 4 out of the 5 skills apply to all leaders. And there's only the 5th skill, the enterprise basics, that apply specifically to the entrepreneurial leader, or startup leader. If you're going to lead startups, you got to know about enterprise basics. Okay. If you're not going to lead startups, you don't. Now you may need something else. If you're a military leader, you do need some military skills. I don't know what they are. I don't study that. But enterprise basic is the only one that's specific to that. And you can map out exactly what that means. The other 4 are pretty generic and highly recommended for any leader. Yeah.
Most startups have teams. So you have 3 to 5 people. So in your model, is just the leader having these traits and none of the others? Or does your core group of 3 to 5 founders, and I'm in a startup now, and we may need some more people, so if anyone's looking, come talk to me. We need a little bit of this in everybody.
That's a good question. Okay, so here's what the facts say. In the United States, there are 700,000 new companies a year. 700,000. By the way, there are only about 700 of those that get outside funding, venture capital funding, professional funding. So, in the professionally funded world, startup teams are prevalent and important. So I'll get to that. But in the vast majority of enterprises, in the vast majority of wealth creation, there's a single primary founder who often works with a spouse or some other friends who can be called co-founders, but there's always a single dominant one. And that the person that sort of needs to be counted on to call the final shots and to correct the problems as they occur, they're the ones that need these skills. In founding teams, there are ways of distributing these skills. It tends to be tricky. It doesn't happen very often. But if you do understand these skills and you are working with people that also have some, for example, the relationship building skills. You can work out who's going to do what when in such a way that you complement one another. So it is possible to divvy this up. And in highly sophisticated enterprises, that happens, fairly often. And that's why, professional funders look at the team dynamics and the like, because it's important. Yeah.
I'm just on a completely different track. I'm just curious. I read a little bit about your background before coming to the event. But could you shed some light on how your professional career evolved and what kind of things you were involved with?
Okay. So my background is, I was an undergraduate here, electrical engineering major, go off to Stanford, get a PhD in applied physics, and then I go into the laser industry, which is brand new, as a bright young, newly minted PhD. Get recruited into the semiconductor industry, and spend 23 years in the semiconductor industry. The first 5 years were pretty gnarly. I was a brash young engineer with a lot of good ideas, but maybe a little hard on brashness. And so I struggled to get people to do what was obvious to me were good ideas. So many of them didn't get done. But eventually, I asked a lot of questions, read books and the like. Got the company gave me coaching, calmed me down, gave me some good skills, and I was able to lead, bigger and bigger, more impactful projects within the semiconductor industry. And it took me 18 years to sort of rise up to be CEO. It was, I started when the company had revenues of $30 million a year, and during my CEO position, it went from about 250 million to 600 and some odd million a year in revenue. So it was very successful. It was a golden age. And then I did a very unusual thing. Okay, so I was super successful CEO, and I decided to retire to start a company from scratch. And that was because there was something that was bothering me about how the technology world was working. I could see a train wreck coming in terms of how the high-tech industry was working. And so I said, if nobody else wants to, change this, I'm going to go and do it. I'm going to change the world. And fortunately, I've been successful enough that, I knew my fellow CEOs, were irritated with this problem. They were willing to, sort of help me get started. I certainly was financially successful. My family would never have to worry about, kids' college education. So I go and do that. Of course, it turned out to be much harder than I expected. It was the dot-com bubble era. Then there was 9/11. There was Lehman Brothers collapse. There was everything possible to confound business, and indeed, it was, at times, a very gloomy prospect, in spite of it being a good idea. But we survived. It was an information business. It provided information about how the technology world works. That provided new insight into, how value chain operates. That became must-have for anybody who operated in the tech world, invested in the tech world, supported the tech world, and so became a valuable company nonetheless. That was bought in 2010 by a big company that came and said, we have to own you. And I said, sorry, but we're not for sale. And they said, certainly everybody has their price, so okay, we were able to put together a good deal. And shortly after that sale was announced, Princeton University called me and asked me to come teach entrepreneurship here. So that's sort of the short.
And you alluded to being a startup coach. So what exactly do you do in that capacity? You said startup coach.
Well, so I probably have 10, 12, 15 startups a week come by, and ask me for advice and the like. I'm not in business to do that. I do that just because I really would love to help see people be successful. But I'm not. Hopefully my book will help a lot of that without in the easiest possible fashion. But there's too much waste in the world, too much wasted time and the like. So I'll do what I can to change that.
Hi, I'm curious to know how you learned the fine art, if you will, of converting a project into a process, a stable process, whether it was through mentoring, trial and error, some course, or all of the above.
Okay, that's a good question. I did it because in the semiconductor industry, there became a general realization that if you're going to make these super sophisticated devices, that you have to be phenomenal in process control. The analogy that we would use with our employees, okay, is if you have a freight train with 100 cars carrying salt, okay, so a freight train with 100 cars of salt, and there's 12 grains of pepper scattered somewhere in those 100 cars, the device won't work. Okay. So we needed purity levels and perfection levels in what we did that had never been seen before to create these super sophisticated microprocessors and transistors. So we had to become real experts in process. And you know what made me realize these insights? Was that I hate processes. I'm a project guy. I love projects. Okay? And the world breaks down basically into project people and process people, but that's probably a discussion for some other time. So I had to reconcile myself with what was going on. I knew about project management and the like, and now I have learned about process management, and I could see how different they were. Unfortunately, I'm not the only person that realized it or talked about it, but a lot of this came out of the semiconductor industry in the 1980s as we got really good at keeping the 12 grains of pepper out of the freight train.
Yes, you talked about the 5 essential traits in entrepreneurial leadership, and I believe you said that they could all be taught and potentially learned. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think then you talked about the idea that doesn't have to be rocket science.
Yeah.
And that's also very encouraging, or perhaps intriguing to think about, because it means that almost anybody could become an entrepreneur in theory.
Yeah.
But the one thing you didn't mention that I want to ask about is if you ask sort of the general public, or if you look in almost any dictionary, the definition of the word entrepreneur includes the word risk somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talk to people, friends, family, about what I do, they inevitably, and I try to encourage them to say, hey, maybe think about doing something for yourself, or striking out on your own, or maybe dropping that job you've had that you don't like, or something like that. There's so much reluctance and resistance from people that I also sense that there's another trait of entrepreneurs that involves the ability to assume risk and take a risk and do something for yourself that's different from what maybe a non-conventional, a conventional path might presume. So I wondered how that plays into your book and your thinking about what makes an entrepreneur.
It's an excellent question. And the real hurdle there is motivation. And you need a certain strong level of motivation to be a successful entrepreneur. Because it is challenging. It is demanding. You have to change yourself when you don't want to. And this motivation thing gets a lot of people off to the wrong career. It makes a lot of people go and think they want to be entrepreneurs when they don't really. And let me give an example, okay? Because the very first question I always ask when somebody shows up in my office is, so, why do you want to be an entrepreneur? And almost always the first answer is, the world needs my idea. That's almost always the answer. The world needs my idea. So I say, okay, if the world needs your idea, I know a lot of people, okay, let me, with your permission, tell somebody who's really good at, making things or providing services or cooking things or whatever, okay, about your idea, and they'll make sure the world gets your idea. Well, that solves your objective. And then invariably they say, no, I don't want that. That's not what I want. And then I say, okay, well then what is it that you do want? Because it's not the world needing your idea. Okay. Often it takes 3 or 4 more programs to get to the heart of what's going on. Okay. But it's got to be a pretty darn good selfish reason. Okay. That's making you want to do this. That's going to make you stick it out. Okay. That's going to make you feel, the right way when things eventually come out okay. And you need to differentiate even between the potential selfish motivations. Classic ones are, I just hate working for anybody else. I just hate taking orders from other people. I just can't stand it. It makes my skin tingle. Okay. That's pretty strong feeling, yeah. You might have it to be an entrepreneur. But then contrast that with somebody else who finally comes to the realization, I have to prove it to my dad that I'm good. Okay? I have to. I'm never going to feel comfortable with myself until I do it. Okay? That's fine. That's pretty strong. Okay. But I bring those two up because it turns out that what decisions you want to make for your company and what path and strategy you take your company down are very different for those two motivations once you've figured it out. Yeah. And I can't tell you how many entrepreneurs I've dealt with over my, decades here that have come to me and said, this just isn't satisfying to me. Okay, I thought it would be by now. But I realized I made a mistake back then because I was doing it for the wrong reason. They never took the time to understand what the reason was that they were doing it for. And so they made the wrong decisions. So it's that motivation. You've got to get there. And if it's not strong enough, don't do it. And don't do it. You'll make more money in a salaried position. Yes, sir. Okay.
I want to preface this question by saying I'm a middle school choir director. So I'm probably one of the more unlikely people to come to a techie meeting. But one of the things that is the biggest player in my motivation to be in my job is passion. And I feel like that should be number 6 in your book. I mean, I didn't hear you say the word passion. I hear that word all the time from entrepreneurs. And I'm wondering, is passion a motivation, or is passion an essential skill that's missing?
Excellent question.
Oh, I'm not a good catcher, but we'll try.
I wouldn't throw that.
Thank you.
Passion is a motivation. Motivation is what drives your actions, and it's based upon your primal desires or fears. So, getting to grips with what your primal desires and fears are is strongly powerful. It's that self-awareness skill that I was talking about. The ability to really understand what your motivations are, what your traits are. Those are the things you're going forward with. Okay. And your skills. Those are task abilities that you develop, you can learn to master and the like. So it's motivations, traits, and skills, and passion sort of comes from the motivation. So, one more question? Okay, well then, you call.
I just see this guy in the middle. Hold there. Yeah. You talked about the 5 skills: self-awareness, relationship, relationship building, motivating others, leading change, and basics of how enterprises work. Now, you said that these can be learned. Can you give us some examples of how these can be learned? Like, can you just read a book or read books about them and learn them yourself, or you will need special coaching for them?
You're not going to get the skill just by reading the book and then the next day. You have to practice it. And as with any skill, the more you can practice it with, the coach, the better you can get. It requires, some coaching. All of these skills are, there's nothing special about them. They're generic skills. You can read on the internet, how to become more self-aware. In the back of my book, I give, loads of notes and about where you can go and things you can read to find these more about it, or people that can help you with it. They're all over the place. Once you're able to break it down into those 5 categories. So, but then start practicing and get feedback on how you're doing. Go out and find mentors. Ultimately, there are a lot of people that love, mentoring. They have, experience and successful experience in, in the area that you're interested in learning about.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was really awesome. So the conversation doesn't end here. You can tweet him, Derek Lidow, and he'll respond to you. All right? So continue the conversation. Just mention Princeton TN. So.